And we are going to start with chapter 24, at the very beginning of the chapter. And if you have Eitz Chaim, it's page 1127. 1127. And we're making the shift now. We were looking at vows and agricultural laws to a degree. And now we're moving to the marital sphere, at least for a little bit. And we get a verse that begins, this is chapter 24, verse 1, page 1127. So, if a man takes a wife, ki yikach ish isha, and the assumption here is that he is the initiator of this marriage. What is striking here is that we have no information as to how. We don't know what's required. And later Jewish law is going to have to deal with that question, for reasons which I think will be apparent in just a moment or two. So he marries someone, Allah, and they not only get married, but they then have marital relations, right? Which seems to be, for reasons that'll become clear, essential to this law. And if she fails to please him, or he has found something obnoxious about her, and he writes her a bill of divorcement and hands it to her and sends her away, and let's just stop there. So, grounds for divorce, not very specific. Something displeasing to him. And there's no sense here that she has the right to refuse. She simply is obliged to accept this divorce, and the implication of it is that she now leaves. So it's worth saying a couple of things here. The first is the Torah here talks about him writing a bill of divorce. It's not entirely clear in biblical times that women could not initiate divorce. In other words, the question is the Torah describing the usual case of a man divorcing his wife, or is the Torah describing something that can only be done in this way? Later Jewish law understands this as a unilateral move by the husband. But there's some evidence, biblical evidence, and even early rabbinic evidence that perhaps a woman could divorce her husband. But the problem with that is that she would have to have the financial wherewithal to do it. Right? Being an unmarried woman in a society where women generally are not bread owners, I'm sorry, bread earners, makes that extremely difficult if it was possible at all. Now, this idea that a husband can divorce his wife without her consent effectively ends around the year 1000. Rabbeinu Gershon, famous for, and this only applied, and I've mentioned this a bit before, only among Ashkenazic Jews, European Jews. He was accepted as the lead halachic decisor, the rabbi who could decide these things for that entire community. He said essentially that men may not divorce their wives against their consent. He also outlawed polygamy. And there are those who see the two as related. That is, Um, if you outlaw polygamy, then it also puts the woman in a more vulnerable situation. Her husband would, if he wants to be with someone else, would simply divorce his wife and then marry the second person, right? So he says, not without her consent. And that seems to be a major move forward, and it's striking that it was accepted. Now, we have a physical, he doesn't merely say, get out of here, I'm done with you. There is a legal instrument which he has to write. And it says, Kitavla, he writes for her Sefer Kritut. It's translated as a bill of divorcement. The karet really means to cut. He writes her a severing document. This is what we commonly call a get today. And one of the requirements of the get, actually, which takes place afterwards, is that the get is literally cut, that a cut is made in the get so as to fulfill this biblical idea that it is a sefer kritut, a document which is cut. Just a few words about gets, gittin. This is a legal procedure as it comes to be down to us through the rabbis. You need a court to do it. That is, it has to be done in the presence of 3 witnesses. Though it says the husband writes it, it's clear, according to the rabbis, it becomes very clear that he will appoint an agent to do that. The laws of the rabbinic understanding of the laws of divorce, which are extremely complex, is that you need an expert to do this, because you want it to be absolutely clear that this couple is no longer married, because without that, she wouldn't be free to marry someone else. So the idea here is, when it says he writes, he appoints someone to act as his agent. And this is consistent with the rabbinic idea that whatever a person can do, they can have an agent do for them. Right? That an agent is like the person who authorizes him in every regard. There's even some evidence that Jews have gotten married by proxy. They would have an agent. They were far away, for example, unable to get there in person. They would have an agent who would do that on their behalf. I just want to take note, because I noticed several people have joined us, that we're in Deuteronomy chapter 24. We're looking at verse 2, which is about divorce. And if you have Eitz Chaim, it's on page 1128. So again, we're talking about what becomes of this law. You need a beit din. This has to be done in the presence of a rabbinic court, which has been constituted. The husband and wife don't have to be together when it's done. The wife could have an agent. The husband can have an agent. The husband who authorizes the person to write the get, to do it on his behalf, needs to have this court gathered around him. And he formally says, write a get for my wife, and this is my name, and this is her name, and so on, and send it to her. Or if they're in the same room, then once it's written, he delivers it to her. The wife can have an agent to accept it on her behalf. And these days, that's often the case. I'd say more often than not, the husband and wife have both assigned agents. And even in the Talmud, that seems to be the case, at least for the husband to send an agent, because there are all kinds of questions about the validity of the divorce if the agent doesn't make it there, she doesn't get it, all kinds of things, right? But it's generally done by agency. So the question is, let's say he initiates this or wants to initiate it, and she is unwilling to accept it. And as I mentioned, since the time of Rabbeinu Gershon, she has to consent. So here's the problem. The problem is, if she doesn't accept it, then she cannot remarry. But he can remarry, because we do have, at least theoretically, though it was outlawed, the idea that men can have more than one wife, that it's not adultery for him to take up with another woman, right? So that puts her at a tremendous disadvantage. And as a result, there is an institution called zikui. A get zikui is a get where a court would appoint an agent to accept the get on behalf of the wife so that she would be free to remarry if she chooses to. Her anger against her husband should not prevent her or limit her in that way. But in order to do this, the tradition is that he has to get 100 rabbis to agree. In other words, it can't just be, she won't take it, I'll send it to her, I'll send it to her agent, too bad, right? This, on the one hand, there's this idea that she should not be tied to a man who is not recognizing those ties. On the other hand, she should have the right to refuse. The idea also is, well, she can't, according to rabbinic law, divorce him. He has to be the one to divorce her. A court could compel him to divorce her. And let me say a word in order to explain that. Let me say a word about the ketubah. So a ketubah, which we often think about as, part of the wedding ceremony, and in our day, it's purely symbolic. It doesn't have any particular meaning, except as sort of evidence that the couple actually had a Jewish wedding. But in rabbinic times, it specifically states what the husband must provide the wife with if he divorces her. So it specifies the settlement, which will enable her to become independent and also might dissuade him from trying to divorce her, because it'll cost him if he wants to divorce her. So the get specifies that. It also specifies the obligations of a husband to his wife. And that's also quite striking, right? Because in a sense, the get is there to limit the husband. And it is those obligations, if he fails to meet them, that allows her to go to the courts in order to compel him to dissolve the relationship. And there are three obligations that a husband has to his wife. The first is that he has to support her by providing her with food, clothing, and shelter. And the other, and I think this is particularly striking, is that he has to gratify her sexually. That a husband's obligation to his wife includes sexual satisfaction. And without that, he is not doing his obligations as a husband. It's worth noting that she does not have a similar obligation to him, right? He cannot compel her to have sex with him. The idea is actually we have this idea, no, honey, I have a headache, that kind of thing, where somehow, he has that right, and she's like, right? But the rabbinic understanding of human psychology is that women have strong sexual needs, and that once married, their husband has a duty to them to help fulfill those needs. If he does not, she can appeal to a court to compel him. One more thing about this. So in traditional Jewish society, that worked well because courts had real power. And in fact, the court could beat him up, physically coerce him into giving her a get. We no longer live in that society, and it's well known, there are husbands who absolutely refuse to divorce their wives, despite the fact that they are doing all kinds of terrible things, or maybe they're using a get to extort funds from her. Ironically, exactly the opposite of the original intent of the ketubah. And so, the woman becomes what's known as an aguna. She's chained to her husband and not free to marry someone else. And the courts can't compel it because Jewish courts don't have that power anymore. Maybe in the Shtetlach of Europe they did, but once Jews have become part of the larger society, they don't. And so we need some sort of remedy to this problem. And in modern times, it often becomes a civil court has granted a divorce. He has the right to go do whatever he wants to do, but she is, in religious terms, still stuck with him. I think I mentioned this once before. The conservative movement came up with two remedies. The first was called the get would be written with something called the Lieberman Clause, which would say if the civil court dissolves a marriage, then they have recourse to the civil courts to compel him to give her a get. And that has largely been upheld in court. That if a husband sues for divorce, he also has to provide a religious divorce, so she is completely free. But if they got married with a ketubah that didn't have that in it, then she doesn't have recourse, and therefore we have this idea, the conservative movement, that a marriage can actually be annulled by a Jewish court. The first idea was originally rejected completely by Orthodox Judaism, this idea that there could be a clause in the ketubah. And strikingly, in recent years, they've come around to it. Not quite in the same form that the conservative movement has. Nonetheless, they have come around to it. The second idea of retroactive annulment is not something that any Orthodox authority would permit. It's really very, very radical. Okay, so talked a little bit about marriage and divorce. Before we move on, I'm going to open it up to questions if there are any about any of this. Hannah, unmute, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I missed something that you said, but I actually went through a divorce in Jerusalem at the Rabbanut, and I didn't know a lot of Hebrew. It was just really frightening. And one of us, I don't know if it was me, one of us had to hold up a paper and the other had to catch it.
Yes. So that is, first of all, the idea that you didn't know Hebrew and that you were subject to this ritual, not knowing exactly what you were doing, seems actually to violate Jewish law. But the courts in Israel are not so careful about these things, unfortunately. At any rate, if you look at the text itself, and we're looking at verse 1, right? He writes a sefer kritut, a get, and he hands it to her and sends her away. And what this has become in sort of in the ritualized form of divorce, as the rabbis understand it, is that she holds her hands out, he drops it into her hands, and then she has to walk several paces. So that in a certain sense, literally, he gives it to her, she receives it, and then it says he sends her away. And just symbolically, she walks away from it.
Yeah.
Other questions about marriage, divorce, ketubas, anything at all? Okay, so we're going to go on to the rest of this law. And that has to do with her status moving forward. Now, when he gives her the get, part of the get says, and behold, you are free to marry anyone. That is part of what divorce does, right? It frees her. So, according to the Torah, now we're going to have a case. The case is he gives it to her, he sends her away, and then she marries somebody else. Now, the second husband also, either he dies or he divorces her. And here the Torah says, the first husband who divorced her shall not take her to wife again, since she has been defiled, for that would be abhorrent to the Lord. You must not bring sin upon the land that the Lord your God is giving to you as a heritage, right? So now, what's striking about this, first of all, is that we have very explicit statements about how the couple is to get divorced. We have no idea how they get married in the first place, right? So it's hard to know, does this marriage act, what does it mean to dissolve it? Was it really a marriage at all? All of that sort of stuff. This is one of the reasons why we have this notion of oral law, that in addition to the written law, the Jewish people received initially with the Torah a kind of oral law. And you can see why that would be necessary. How do you apply this law if you don't know what constitutes a valid marriage? So the oral law, the tradition, tells us what that is. Okay, so why is there such a law? It's very unclear. Somehow it's unseemly or defiling for this husband to now be with his wife in a situation which is clearly not adultery, but kind of looks like adultery. He slept with her as his wife, then there was this other man she slept with, and then comes back. There is this, some people have suggested that this law is really about wife swapping. So he can't simply, okay, you're divorced, and then you'll go with this other guy and marry him for the moment. He'll divorce you, you'll come back to me, right? So I don't know that that's true. It seems far-fetched to me. For whatever reason, this is the law. I have to say that I was shocked to read that according to Islamic law, exactly the opposite is true. If a man divorces his wife and wishes to remarry her, she has to sleep with somebody else in the interim. I just find this astonishing. But apparently, the way this was done is that they would find an indigent person. He would sleep, and he would be paid to do this. He would sleep with her for one night, and then she could remarry her first husband, right? So Jewish law, by the way, has, not only does it have this law, but it also has the idea that if a woman wants to, if a couple who has been divorced decides to get together again and remarry, not only isn't it problematic, but it's actually viewed in very positive terms. They say that the altar weeps when a couple gets divorced. And so there's joy when they get remarried again without someone in the interim. Please also note that there is no stigma attached to divorce here, right? It's just assumed they get divorced, marry somebody else, right? Unlike, for example, the Catholic Church, which forbid divorce, needed to find some reason to state that the former marriage didn't really happen, or something like that, or she didn't know what she was getting, whatever it was, right? There is no sense, because in church doctrine, and we still hear this in English, right? There are wedding vows. So what, to honor, love, cherish until both of us depart, right? The idea is it's until death separates us. Jews don't make it a vow at a wedding. They make promises in some informal way, we want to share everything together. It's often romantic sort of promises, but they're not vows. Because a vow, as you know, because we've studied it, is very stringent, and a person is not permitted to violate a vow, right? We don't have vows. We have contracts, right? A couple makes an agreement, and it has certain responsibilities on one party, it has certain responsibilities on the other, and agreements can be severed. And this is how that agreement is severed. So it's a radically different view of marriage. It's not an unending commitment no matter what. It's an agreement that both sides will endeavor to do their best to maintain this relationship, and that they have obligations to each other, which can only be severed in a formal way. But there is no stigma. The only thing that looks a little like stigma is the idea that a Kohen, a priest, could not marry a divorcee, but she can marry anyone else. It's not about a stigma to divorce. It's really about his maintaining himself in a particular state of purity. And it's interesting that at least in biblical times, we do have an example of a husband, according to the rabbis, remarrying their first wife. Well, actually not first wife, but wife. And remember, this is a polygamous society. And what I have in mind is Abraham and Hagar. Now, you remember the story. Abraham's married to Sarah. She's infertile. He takes Hagar, who is her maid, as his wife, and they have Ishmael. And then he sends them away. Isaac ultimately comes to live with Ishmael and with Hagar, at least for a period of time. Sarah dies, and Abraham takes another wife. Her name is Keturah. Who is Keturah? The rabbis say it's Hagar, which is really quite touching. He didn't want to send her away. The Torah and God says, no, you have to do what Sarah tells you, right? But in the end, the rabbinic view is that Abraham marries Hagar, and they end up with that marriage, and they have a lot of children together. Okay, so since we're talking about marriage, we're going to look at now a different law. We're at verse 5. When a man takes a bride, he shall not go out with the army or be assigned to it for any purposes. He shall be exempt for 1 year for the sake of his household, to give happiness to the woman that he has married. Really striking. Now, we saw a kind of exemption before to a man who was betrothed his wife. They weren't yet married. And that was also, you remember, in the context of a man who's built a house and so on, he was to have some enjoyment. But there was no term specified, right? And there was no clear reason specified. There it was really about him, that he should have some enjoyment before he goes to war. Here, it's a year, and it's for her. And what is it? What is it that he does? Right? The Hebrew is b'simach et ishto. He causes her to rejoice, and certainly some authorities have seen this in very sexual ways. That they have to have that enjoyment. I've heard stories, and I would guess that there's something to them about people who are sent. I'm thinking back to the Second World War, for example. A man is about to go off to war. He marries a woman so that they will be married, and then off he goes. Presumably, they will live as husband and wife when he comes back, if he survives. This is not that. Right? This is very different than that. He marries her, he has a year's exemption, and not just an exemption from warfare, which might kill him. But what's the exemption? Go out with the army, that's war, or be assigned to it for any purpose, right? Not go to the front, not battle, just, be the guy behind the lines who does X or Y or Z to support. No, according to the Torah, no, they have a year together, which I think is quite striking. Okay, one more time, I'm gonna open it up. Any questions about this, about the intermediate marriage, about the exemption for the married man from warfare? Yeah, Barry.
So in biblical times, there was the concept of a concubine. So
Yeah.
Is that considered? Is that a different status than
That's a good
than
question.
marriage? So I'm thinking in
Right.
terms of
Right.
Hagar. Is that really a marriage?
Yes, so that's a good question that I don't know the answer to. It is one I'm curious, and I'm just going to make myself a note and look into it. And depending on whether I find something or not, I will let you know next week. Okay.
Thank you. And also in certainly in the Catholic Church, marriage is considered one of the 7 sacraments.
Yes.
So it's very much associated with
Yeah.
God, rather than
Yeah.
beyond much beyond just a contractual agreement between
Right.
people.
Well, remember that marriage, the word sacrament is complicated, right? Because marriage means it's called kiddushin, which comes from the root kodesh, which means holiness, right? So marriage is viewed as a holy, sacred state. One doesn't have to engage in it, right? But it elevates the relationship of a couple to something sacred. So, a sacrament, no, right? But it would be a mistake just to view it as merely a contract. And there's something, and to a certain extent, also, of course, the word kodesh means separate. So perhaps this is about separating this relationship from all other relationships, but I think it also is about elevating the relationship, which makes the question of concubinage, I think, particularly interesting, because that is not known as kiddushin. So I don't know. I'll come back to you.
I was referring specifically to the concept of sacrament within the Catholic Church.
Yes, no, I understand that. what I,
I'm just waiting, and just, yeah, just one third item. So,
Yeah.
you know, with regard to a man who's recently married, you know, perhaps, you know, there's the concept that his seed should continue even if he should die in the war. So maybe there's some of that
um,
in allowing
right.
in allowing him to be with his wife for 1 year, so that presumably she'll get pregnant.
No, it's an interesting idea, right? I would say that, well, it's certainly possible. The text itself says this is about joy to the woman, right? Now, whether, by the way, what you say is interesting in light of a different Jewish law, which is that if a couple gets a divorce, the woman is not permitted to remarry for 3 months. Why? To determine paternity, right? If you know 3 months have passed, it's clear she's not pregnant. And it's clear, therefore, that the husband, the first husband, is not the father of the child, right? So that, and it's really interesting to me because let's assume that there's no possibility that they could have had sex prior to that. In other words, let's assume that the husband and wife are living on different continents at the time, and have been, let's say, for a year, and have had no contact whatsoever. So the idea that she could have been impregnated by her former husband is simply impossible. Right? Nonetheless, the law stands. It stands because people, you don't want this idea. There is this, by the way, there is this idea, well, one last time for old time's sake, right before the divorce, that kind of thing. Anyway, all good questions. I'll get back to you about the concubine, depending on what I'm able to find. Saul, I think you had your hand up. No, you're good. Anybody else? Okay, we're going to leave the marital realm. And we're going to start worrying, though there'll be one interruption, starting to think about now the poor. And if you look at verse 6 now, a hand mill or an upper millstone should not be taken as a pawn. And here we're talking about someone who has loaned money to a second person and wants to compel repayment. And so they take some item and they'll repay it, they'll return it at the time of repayment, by the time of repayment, right? And so the idea here is, what is a hand mill or an upper millstone? This is something which enables a person to make flour and eat bread, which was the primary substance that people lived on in antiquity. So there are limits to what you can take in pawn. Right? And the rabbis expand this to anything, really, that a person needs either to survive or to be able to repay the debt. If you rob someone of the means to repay you, I mean, we do have the sabbatical year, and eventually the debt will be canceled. And that would be even more reason to try to compel the person to repay the debt quickly, because otherwise you might lose it. The other thing I want to say about this is that according to rabbinic law, and there's some evidence of biblical law also, that this is after the terms of the loan. That is, a person has defaulted on the loan that they had received, and it is only now where there's this idea that you can do something to compel the person to repay this loan, which they have not repaid. So then we get a law about kidnapping. If a person is found to have kidnapped a fellow Israelite, enslaving him or selling him, the kidnapper shall die, thus you'll sweep away, right? So we have a very, very strong notion that kidnapping is forbidden, and that the response is capital. There are those who read this law and the idea that capital punishment would ensue to say that in the Ten Commandments, when it says thou shalt not steal, they're talking about stealing people. Because in general, in the Ten Commandments, you're talking about things that are punished by capital punishment, right? So, for example, murder, adultery, and if you look through them, you'll find almost universally that the Ten Commandments are talking about capital offenses. And so perhaps that's what it means. At any event, this is, and I have to say, you read this and you can't help but think about what's going on in Gaza. And these people, infants and children who were kidnapped and continue to be held. And you read this and the idea of this extraordinary penalty, and it has some resonance. Okay, then we get it sort of doesn't belong here. It's because it's stuck, as you'll see, in between laws about making loans and having a surety. If you have a skin affliction, right, this is called sara'at, right? If you get this disease, often translated as leprosy, certainly Hertz translated as leprosy, King James translated as leprosy. It's almost certainly not leprosy, some kind of skin affliction. It also it seems to infect buildings, it infects clothing. Who knows what it is? But you must be careful to do exactly as the priests instruct you. They will separate you from the community, right? Put you in quarantine. They will inspect, be sure, right? They have this medical role. Do exactly what they say, take care. Remember what the Lord your God did to Miriam on the journey from Egypt. We won't go into the details of why, but she's stricken with leprosy or with this sara'at, and she is separated from the community and then allowed to rejoin. Why Miriam? Why this story here? The most reasonable suggestion that I came across, which seems to be the case, even Miriam, right? Don't think that this law doesn't apply universally. Even Miriam had to be separated from the camp. Okay, now we're back to loans. When you make a loan of any sort to your countryman, you must not enter his house to seize his pledge, right? So here we have this idea that just because someone is a debtor, just because they have not repaid you, there is a certain sanctity to their household. You have to remain outside while the man to whom you made the loan brings the pledge out to you, right? Doesn't get done in the presence of his family if there's some disgrace. So the Torah is doing a kind of balancing act here. On the one hand, we want people to make loans, and therefore we want to make sure that they get repaid. On the other hand, the debtor needs to be able to preserve their dignity. And a great deal of the legislation, and this is clearly a poor person, right? This is not a capitalist who's been raising money for a startup, right? This is a person who really has become indebted to the extent that you might seize the millstone and then they would have no other way of getting food. As we're going to see Another example of that in the middle. Nonetheless, he has to maintain his dignity. If he's a needy man, you shall not go to sleep in his pledge. You must return the pledge to him at sundown, so that he may sleep in his cloths and bless you, and it will be a merit before the Lord your God. Right? So you can't take his sleeping garment, right, and hold it, because it would be a privation to him, a serious privation. You can have it, but you have to return it before he goes to sleep. This idea that he will bless you seems a little far-fetched. I think the implication here is rather he will not complain about you to God, because God is, after all, the protector of the poor, as we're going to see, the widow and the orphan, right? So he will refrain from calling out to God if you treat him with certain basic dignity and are aware of his needs, his fundamental needs. I just wanted to read quickly a passage from Amos, the prophet, because it seems to me to be, it certainly relates in a certain way to this passage. So Amos here is decrying the people that he lives among. He lives in a very wealthy community where people are nonetheless neglecting the poor. He says, you trample the heads of the poor into the dust of the ground. They recline, that is, the people who trample the poor, they recline by every altar on garments taken in a pledge, right? Exactly what the Torah forbids here. That's what these people are doing. They grind the poor into the dust. They take their pledges. Not only do they not return them at night, they sleep in them. And not only do they sleep in them, they sleep in them beside the altar. Right? The utter contempt for the poor and the idea that God will not requite this. And of course, Amos's message is, oh, God will requite this, and you, having lived this corrupt way, are in, you are deserving of the punishment that you will receive. Okay, so we're going to, I think, well, one more thing, because we'll sort of round this out. You should not abuse a needy, destitute laborer, right? So this is not someone now who took a loan and didn't repay it in time. This is simply a laborer, someone you hire to do work, right? And the assumption here is that it is either a day worker or a contract worker who needs the money for their basic necessities. You should not abuse a poor or destitute laborer, whether a fellow countryman or a stranger. You must pay his wages the same day before the sun sets, for he is needy and urgently depends on it, or he will cry out to God, and you will cry out to the Lord against you, and you will incur guilt. So again and again here, we see specific laws to protect the poor. Beyond, so there are sort of two sides, right? There's you are obligated to sustain them on the one hand, and you are also obligated to protect them from your own superior position. You're not to take advantage of them. The Hebrew lo ta'ashok, right, is used not only, understood by the rabbis, not only with regard to the poor, but all circumstances in which you take advantage of people's poverty or neglect poor people. So we're going to stop here because the next verse, which is about parents not being put to death for children or children for the death of parents, as you undoubtedly know, is particularly problematic in light of a place where God says the children will be, where the Torah says the children will be punished for the sins of their parents. And so we'll deal with that thorny issue next time. Okay, so one last opportunity for questions of any kind on anything. So,
I just wanted to mention the Haftarah of Vayeshev is the one where you quoted Amos.
yes,
I'm not going to read it this time because it's Hanukkah, I think, but
yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned it. Yeah, I love Amos. I've taught classes in the book of Amos several times over the years. It's just, he's just so, I don't know, so powerful in his condemnation of the people around him, and then he gets into trouble for it, and it's just, I think, a remarkable book. I will say that the first time I taught the book of Amos, I called it Amos and Andy. So, or Amos with Andy, I suppose. Any other comments? Yeah, Hannah.
Doesn't Catholicism have any scripture about helping the poor? That was
Oh,
just
absolutely.
Jesus, that was the
Yeah,
main.
this is certainly not specific to Judaism. Christianity and Islam also. One of the obligations of a Muslim not only is to pray multiple times a day, but it is specifically to be charitable, to give to the poor. So I don't think this is, yeah, now you could simply say, well, Christianity and Islam are ultimately, they come out of Judaism. But I mean, I'd like to think that beyond that, it's just, basic human dignity, and a sense that what we have comes from God, and we're obligated, therefore, to do what God wants us to do with it, which is to take care of those who don't have. Other comments, questions? Okay, so I'll look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks to those of you who have supported the class. I really appreciate it. And I want to wish you a good week and look for the link to the recording, which will go out later today. So take care, everybody.
Thank you.
very much.
Sure.